American Revolution, Battle of Lexington and Concord, 1775. In 1775, the plains of North America are caught up in war. From Lexington to Yorktown, brothers will fight against each other as the once loyal 13 colonies choose between supporting the mother country or fighting for liberty and a new beginning. This is the tale of the American Revolution. Let's delve into the key battles, strategies, and politics that will eventually lead to the birth of a nation. More than 150 years before the Battle of Lexington and the shots that will ignite the American Revolution, Europeans began to colonize the Americas. They settled in places like Jamestown and Quebec, and by the 1750s, the colonies evolved from precarious trading posts into vast and complex settlements, divided among the leading powers of Europe. The British colonists brought with them a tradition of democracy and fundamental rights, achieved through centuries of warfare and rebellion. With a significant portion of landowners, about 60% of the male European population were eligible to vote, which is a much higher percentage compared to Britain. Most of the 13 colonies have appointed or elected royal governors, who are nominally in charge, but their power is balanced by local representative assemblies and councils. These elected assemblies handle issues ranging from local taxes to militia budgets, but new laws, including new taxes, are also imposed by Parliament in London, which views its authority over the colonies as absolute. In 1756, the first truly global conflict breaks out, the 7 Years' War. North America becomes a crucial battleground between Great Britain and its longtime rival France. Both sides rely heavily on native allies, but colonial militias play a vital role for the British in gaining an advantage in the conflict as they start to shape their future on the continent. Although the British emerge victorious and become the dominant power in North America, they finish the war financially strained and increasingly expect the colonies to help shoulder the financial burden of their defense. However, they believe the colonists are already represented in Parliament simply by being British subjects, and thus see no reason to consult colonial governments directly on how to raise these funds. Many in Great Britain are upset by the notion of taxing British subjects without formal representation in Parliament, a sentiment echoed by many colonists. This includes Britain's wartime leader during the 7 Years' War, William Pitt, who expressed his opinion in the House of Commons in 1766, stating that the kingdom has no right to impose taxes on the colonies. He warned that such practices could not last and would ultimately lead to separation. In the colonies, the imposition of new taxes without consent is becoming a significant grievance. While remaining loyal to King George IV, many colonists feel that their rights as Englishmen, including the right to local representative government, are being overlooked by a distant and disconnected Parliament. After several unsuccessful attempts to raise revenue in the 1760s, anger and resistance begin to rise against Parliament's interference throughout the colonies. In 1767, the London government tries to assert its power through a series of laws known as the Townshend Acts, aiming to raise much-needed funds and set the stage for future laws that would ensure the colony's financial self-sufficiency. Unfortunately, the plans backfire, and the Townshend Acts only escalate tensions. In Boston, riots erupt, prompting the deployment of regular troops to protect local officials. The situation escalates, and an angry crowd provokes soldiers into firing, resulting in the tragic deaths of 5 colonists in what will soon be known as the Boston Massacre. Although the soldiers, referred to locally as regulars, are removed from Boston, tensions in the city remain high. 3 years later, in protest against laws that undermine the price of smuggled tea, Bostonians, disguised as Native Americans, board East India Company ships and dump 9,000 pounds worth of goods into the harbor. The British government responds swiftly and harshly, introducing what will soon be known as the Intolerable Acts to send a strong message across the colonies, which includes replacing self-governance in Massachusetts with direct British control. However, rather than suppressing further acts of rebellion, the Intolerable Acts lead to the gathering of the First Continental Congress in October 1774. In Philadelphia, delegates come together from various colonies to discuss their collective response as encountered. The British forces make their way through the countryside with relative ease. However, as they approach Concord, the alarm is raised, and the local militias begin to gather. The atmosphere is charged with tension as the Patriots prepare to stand their ground. Meanwhile, General Gage's plan to catch the rebel leadership unawares is starting to unravel. The sense of unity among the colonies is growing stronger, and the determination to resist British authority is palpable. As the sun rises on that fateful day, the first shots of what will become a long struggle for independence are about to be fired. It was expected that to speed up their movement, each soldier would carry limited ammunition, a decision that would later prove disastrous. As the British marched, colonial riders spotted them moving west ahead of the column. Smith then heard reports from his forward units that large militia forces were gathering in Lexington, unsettling news that quickly spread throughout the ranks. Smith realized they had lost the element of surprise and sent word back to Boston requesting reinforcements. When British forces arrived in Lexington, the town's militia was present. Similar to previous confrontations, neither side anticipated bloodshed, and the militia of 80 men, commanded by John Parker, intentionally did not block the road to Concord or plan to engage with regular troops. Parker instructed his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they intend to have a war, let it begin here." Without orders, a British advance guard moved onto the Lexington Common instead of marching past to Concord. Commanders on both sides urged their men not to fire, and the militia was told to disperse. About 100 local spectators watched curiously as the two forces exchanged insults. As the militiamen began to leave, a single shot rang out from somewhere on the common. In the ensuing confusion, shots were fired from both sides until a British company volley fired without orders. Unbeknownst to those on the field, the first blood had been shed in the American Revolutionary War, with 8 militiamen lying dead on Lexington Common. Smith regained control of the situation and reprimanded his stunned officers, reminding them of Gage's orders. The troops were recalled, and the march continued toward Concord. The day was still young, and Smith hoped they could complete their mission despite the setback at Lexington. Upon arriving in Concord, the British searched buildings where residents granted them permission and burned the small amounts of contraband they found. However, there were no rebel leaders or large military stores, as anything of value had been dispersed hours earlier by the rebels. By 9 a.m., 400 colonial militia had gathered in the surrounding hills under Colonel Barrett's command. They had heard rumors of the events at Lexington and saw smoke rising from Concord. Assuming the regulars were burning the town, many were surprised and angered by the apparent escalation, but were determined to meet fire with fire. The exhausted British regulars resting in the town were still unaware of the dramatic change in sentiment or the large numbers of militia slowly surrounding their position. Now observed by the evacuated townspeople, Barrett and the militia resolved to save the town and advanced. Barrett's force quickly routed the 90 regulars holding the bridge. However, likely stunned by both the escalation and their success, they fell back to regroup on the hill. There were now over 1,000 militia surrounding Concord, and Smith recognized it was time to leave. The regulars spread out along the road for protection and began their march back toward Lexington. Yet, columns of militia ominously shadowed their movements, leading to a race to the first bridge. The situation had drastically changed for Smith and his men, who were perilously outnumbered and far from the safety of Boston Harbor. Shots began to ring out, and the regulars suffered casualties as they crossed the bridge. British skirmishers attempted to flank the militia, who positioned themselves behind walls, trees, and undergrowth. Those caught were killed, but most militiamen, having spent years fighting and living in the rugged terrain of North America, delivered disciplined and effective musket fire before moving positions. As the pace of the march quickened in sheer desperation, the regulars were repeatedly ambushed by the now over 2,000-strong militia. Casualties began to mount as the British tactical formations proved ineffective in the wooded countryside, and their limited ammunition started to dwindle. They spread out wherever possible, but at narrow passes like the now infamous Bloody Angle, discipline and cohesion began to break as the force fought for its life. The Lexington militia under Parker, who had been scattered by the British just 8 hours earlier, regrouped and prepared for revenge. Parker positioned his men well on a wooded hill overlooking the road. As they opened fire, British commander Lieutenant Colonel Smith was hit in the leg and fell from his horse wounded. Desperate fighting continued up to a final ambush outside of Lexington, where the British, now exhausted from 14 hours of marching and fighting, were on the verge of surrender. Smith and his men staggered into the town, defeated by the superior tactics, tenacity, and sheer number of colonial militia. But just as all hope seemed lost, cheers erupted in the British ranks. Smith's request for reinforcements had been answered. Under the command of Earl Percy, 1,000 British regulars surrounded Lexington with 2 field guns. Percy took overall command, reorganizing Smith's battered force and resting them in the town. However, the battle was not over, and although reinforced, the British were still hopelessly outnumbered by the now 4,000-strong colonial militia, who showed no signs of being intimidated by the presence of British reinforcements. Percy soon continued the march, with Smith's battered formation in the middle of the column. A militia general, William Heath, arrived to take overall command of the colonial forces. He instructed the militia to avoid large British formations due to the threat posed by the deadly field guns. Heath's forces had to continually rotate to engage the British along the road, a time-consuming and challenging maneuver. Desperate street fighting and bloody hand-to-hand combat ensued as the British column entered the town of Menotomy. Some atrocities were committed by desperate and frightened British troops as each building was cleared of sharpshooters. Many were killed on both sides in Menotomy, including one militiaman who died fighting from his home, declaring to his comrades, "An Englishman's home is his castle." The militia had a large force organized and waiting at Cambridge, but Percy decided instead to march toward Charlestown, rightfully cautious of a trap. As the final hill was cleared of militia, the British column limped into Charlestown, finding safety in Boston Harbor and the protection of Royal Navy guns. The first battle of the American Revolution was over, although it resulted in relatively minor casualties on both sides. The battle was nonetheless monumental. The war had officially begun, and as Patriot leader John Adams later wrote, "The die is cast and Rubicon crossed." In the aftermath of the battle, and in what must have felt like the world turning upside down, trenches and redoubts were dug around the city, putting Boston under siege. In the days and weeks following the battle, volunteers from all over the 13 colonies marched to join the army, transforming the militia into a truly American force for the first time. Although they may have lacked the equipment and professionalism of a modern army, they had nonetheless succeeded in their first test of what would soon become a grueling war. General Gage's strategy to prevent conflict had dramatically failed, along with the British government's plan to enforce colonial compliance without the consent of its people. In London, Parliament quickly blamed Gage for recklessly starting a civil conflict, despite the fact that he was following their orders. Even as the shots at Lexington echoed around the world, Parliament's position remained unchanged, and British reinforcements were soon dispatched to the colonies. What began as civil and legal arguments over rights and taxation had now transformed into outright war in Massachusetts. The opening battle ended in colonial victory, but the battle at Lexington was just the beginning, and the British would soon strike back. Thank you for watching our first episode on the American Revolution. Sieges of Savannah and Charleston, 1778 to 80. Since the start of the war in 1775, the northern colonies have become the center of the fighting. The North has always been a hub of revolution, with cities like Boston serving as important centers of resistance against British rule. In an effort to quell the revolution where it was most supported, the British have concentrated many of their efforts in New England. However, by 1778, both sides find themselves in a stalemate, and the British are seeking a way to change the situation. The southern colonies differ greatly from their northern counterparts. Their economies are primarily based on agriculture, featuring a plantation system that grows cash crops like tobacco and rice, which require large amounts of land and a substantial labor force. The population in the colonies is relatively evenly distributed, with a total black and white population exceeding 2.1 million by the 1770s. However, nearly 90% of enslaved individuals live in the South, comprising almost half of its population. Slavery plays a crucial role in the southern economies, as the success of plantations relies heavily on this practice. To maintain the fragile balance of this system and guard against the potential for slave uprisings, many leaders in the South, both patriots and loyalists, are careful about fully committing to the war effort. Nevertheless, fighting continues. In Virginia, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, intended to resist as the war began. His proclamation in 1775 significantly heightened tensions in the colony. He offered freedom to slaves who would leave their masters and join the British Army, declared martial law, and labeled anyone who did not fight for the king as a traitor. Dunmore's proclamation left very little room for compromise and directly challenged what Virginians viewed as their fundamental rights. Although Lord Dunmore raised loyalist militias and a regiment of former slaves, his proclamation largely angered Virginians. By late 1775, British forces were defeated at the Battle of Great Bridge and quickly driven out of the colony. In the Carolinas, with no British regular forces around, both sides quickly worked to gather local militias. The Patriots are in control of the towns, while the Loyalists hold the backcountry. In February 1776, the two forces finally clash, and the outcome for the colony is determined by a fierce charge from sword-wielding Scottish settlers against the entrenched Patriot forces. The Loyalists suffer heavy losses due to precise musket fire, and this defeat leads to the capture of nearly 1,000 Loyalists, along with the mass arrest of their leaders. The British encounter similar challenges in Georgia, where Royal Governor James Wright is compelled to flee in March 1776. The only place where the British are managing to maintain control is Florida, where several continental expeditions aimed at capturing St. Augustine have been successfully repelled. The town is quickly filling up with Loyalist refugees escaping from the Carolinas and Georgia, who passionately burn effigies of revolutionary leaders like Sam Adams and John Hancock in the city center. However, for the rest of the South during the first 3 years of the war, the British largely leave the colonies uncontested and in the hands of Patriot forces. Even though many Loyalists feel let down by the lack of action, support for the king still persists in the South, especially in rural communities. General Clinton is now planning to leverage this support as he seeks to break the stalemate in the war. When war broke out at Lexington in 1775, many American colonists faced a stark choice. This was not simply a war against the British, but a civil war between Americans, and before independence could be achieved, those loyal to the crown would also have to be defeated. The resulting war would divide families, shatter communities, and create deep ideological rifts that would reshape the future of a nation and the world. Civil wars, by their nature, are often more brutal than wars between nations. Cycles of revenge and retaliation escalate and fuel the violence. The American Revolution would be no different, with some of the bloodiest battles of the war being fought between American-only units. Across the 13 colonies, individuals had to consider their core beliefs by choosing a side. Are you defending your country or taking up arms against it? Loyalism cut across social, racial, and ideological lines in the 13 colonies. Some felt a strong allegiance to king and country, while others were more pragmatic and considered their own self-interest and self-preservation in a tumultuous war. But few had a blind allegiance to Britain. Most Loyalists still cherished their rights and yearned for the political representation afforded to them as Englishmen. Loyalists often shared the very same grievances as their Patriot countrymen against Parliament in London, but when war finally came, they ultimately chose a different side. Historians estimate that between 1 in 5 and 1 in 3 colonists remained loyal, and during the war, up to 50,000 Americans fought in Loyalist militias, provisional regiments, or directly in the British Army. A further 20,000 slaves fought for the British, including slaves owned by Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, along with over 10,000 Indians participated in the conflict. But what motivated them to fight, and what happened to them after the war? From the beginning of the conflict, British military planners recognized that the small and globally dispersed British Army would require significant Loyalist support to overcome the rebellion. Efforts to recruit Loyalists often appealed to emotions such as love for one's country, nostalgia for British heritage, and the desire for stability under the current government and rule of law. However, material self-interest was also a factor. It was common to offer financial incentives for joining the cause, and more importantly, generous land grants were promised to new recruits. Many of those who enlisted were landless laborers, the sons of farmers or recent immigrants, and the prospect of acquiring land in the 13 colonies after the war was a particularly appealing incentive. There were also some significant risks involved. To gather funds and diminish Loyalist support, Patriot forces and revolutionary governments took part in the widespread confiscation of Loyalist property. The British Army had a reputation for capturing territory, raising Loyalist forces, and then quickly abandoning those areas, which left entire families facing retribution from Patriots. As the war went on, many tens of thousands of men, women, and children from both sides moved to seek safety behind friendly lines to avoid persecution. For the Loyalists, key locations were mainly centered around New York in the north and St. Augustine in the south. For the 20,000 runaway slaves who joined the Loyalist cause and the 5,000 who sided with the Patriots, the risks they faced were significantly greater. Leaving a plantation came with extreme dangers, and if captured after a battle, they could expect little mercy. For those courageous enough to escape their masters, the decision of which side to join was straightforward. They chose the one that seemed to offer the best chance for freedom. Most Loyalists who enlisted to fight were organized into provincial regiments. These units were often trained and equipped similarly to the British Army and included formations like the Loyal American Rangers, the Royal Regiment of New York, and the King's American Dragoons. They took part in major campaigns alongside British forces and frequently acted as light infantry, combating Patriot irregular forces and their guerrilla tactics. For men captured on both sides, it was not uncommon to switch allegiances, sometimes multiple times, to avoid internment camps, prison ships, or worse. After a battle, it was also common for entire local militias to change sides, as occurred in New York following the British arrival. When the war concluded, around 100,000 Americans chose to leave the new country, representing nearly 5% of the pre-war population. These individuals traveled far and wide and received financial compensation, land, and supplies through an empire-wide program for refugees. A small number moved to Britain, but most left for new beginnings in other colonies, such as Nova Scotia and those in the Caribbean, saw some Loyalists finding work with the East India Company, settling as new colonists in Australia, or, for some black Loyalists, becoming settlers in a new African colony for former slaves in Freetown, Sierra Leone. The men and women who traveled brought with them American ways of thinking, which spread throughout the empire. This often included a strong sense of their rights, a skepticism towards imperial authority, and a desire for political representation. The war had a significant impact on the British, marking the beginning of a shift from a commercial Atlantic empire to a fresh start in Asia. This recovery was largely supported by American Loyalists, who promoted expansion and helped to reshape the empire with liberal ideas, offering a compelling alternative to the Republican movements emerging in France and across the Americas. Ultimately, the fate of many Loyalists reflected that of the empire itself. After enduring the hardships of civil war, a future filled with global success and international prominence was on the horizon. In late 1778, General Clinton is considering his options for the war following the inconclusive battles of Monmouth and Rhode Island in the previous months. He has some 29,000 men in New York and is under increasing pressure from his political masters in London to open a new front. In the South, it is widely believed that Loyalists are quietly waiting for an opportunity to rise up against the rebels in the southern states, and the arrival of British troops would quickly collapse continental control. By November 78, Clinton is ready to send a force of 3,000 men south. 1 British, 2 Hessian, and 4 Loyalist regiments are dispatched, with the mission of capturing Savannah and returning Georgia to British rule. Further north lay the true prize, capturing the city of Charlestown in the more populous South Carolina. The British forces, led by the capable Scotsman, Lieutenant Colonel Campbell, arrived near the mouth of the Savannah River on December 23rd. They faced opposition from 850 Continental regulars and militia, who tried to hold back the British outside the city. During the engagement, the British flanked the Continental force, leading to a rout. In the aftermath, Savannah is quickly captured, and in the following days, the countryside falls to British forces. Local Loyalists begin a campaign of revenge, earning Patriot farms and plantations. By mid-January, several thousand British reinforcements arrive from Florida under the command of Anglo-Swiss General Augustin Prevost, who takes charge of British forces in the south. Campbell is soon sent north and captures Augusta in late January, which is the seat of the Patriot government in Georgia. With the rapid advances of the British, Loyalists start to turn out in large numbers, enrolling over 1,000 men in Augusta alone. For British command, the southern strategy seems to be effective, as more militias form to join their campaign. In South Carolina, wealthy landowner Lieutenant Colonel John Boyd has been raising a Loyalist militia of about 800 men to march to Augusta and join the British. However, the Continentals have not been idle since the setback at Savannah. The Continental Army commander in the South, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, has been gathering forces of his own. One such patriot militia, led by another South Carolinian landowner, Colonel Andrew Pickens, has been carefully tracking Boyd and his men as they move south into Georgia. On the morning of February 14th, the Loyalists. The camp is peaceful now, and in a friendlier area, the horses are grazing freely, with only a few pickets on duty. For the first time since arriving in Georgia, the British flag is raised and drums are playing. However, at 10 a.m., things are about to change quickly. Colonel Pickens is leading around 400 Patriot militiamen as they move down from the high ground towards the camp. Even though they are outnumbered almost 2-1, the Patriots have the advantage of surprise. As they get closer, musket fire is exchanged with Loyalist sentries, alerting the rest of the camp to the impending danger. Boyd quickly gathers 100 select men and rushes to set up a makeshift defensive line against a fence to confront their fellow countrymen. The militias engage in a firefight in the center, with both sides holding their ground. Amidst the smoke and chaos, neither side gives in until the Loyalist leader Boyd is struck and falls to the ground, gravely wounded. Panic spreads quickly, prompting the Loyalists to retreat to their main defensive line, leaving behind their horses and supplies. Pickens has sent part of his troops through the swamps to flank both sides of the camp, but the Loyalists have already crossed the river. Despite the shock of battle and the loss of their commander, they begin to regroup on a hill. Without wasting any time, Pickens' men charge across the river under fire to attack the hill from 3 directions. The fighting lasts nearly an hour, but under pressure from multiple sides, the Loyalists eventually break and scatter into the surrounding countryside. As the firing subsides, Pickens finds Boyd, who is dying on the battlefield. The two had known each other before the war in South Carolina, and Pickens quickly calls for medical assistance. They talk about the battle like old friends, and Boyd gives Pickens a letter for his wife, which he promises to deliver after Boyd's passing just a few hours later. The battle proved costly for the Loyalists, who lost 70 men and had another 75 captured. While 270 of them would eventually join the British, many more would return home and face the mercy of Patriot authorities. More importantly, this battle significantly hinders Loyalist recruitment efforts across the South, once again showing the British's inability to protect locally raised troops. In Augusta, Campbell has been hearing reports about approaching Continental forces. On February 14th, he decides to leave the town and begins his retreat south. However, the British keep a close watch on the Continentals and make their move at the Battle of Breer Creek on March 3rd, almost overwhelming the entire Continental force. This battle leads many Patriot militiamen to return home, but despite the British victory, Augusta and much of the backcountry come back under Continental control. By June, General Lincoln has regrouped his forces and has around 2,000 men ready to march from Charlestown. To recapture Savannah, he realizes he will need naval assistance. Luckily for Lincoln, French Admiral Estaing is available with a large fleet and 4,000 troops. The French admiral had spent the first half of the year attacking and capturing British possessions in the Caribbean, but is now back to support the Continentals in the South. By September, the Allies are prepared, and both Lincoln and Estaing move against Savannah. The city, with around 450 houses, is situated on hills above the river. The British, utilizing slave labor, have constructed extensive defensive works outside the city and have nearly 5,000 men defending it. They have also scuttled ships to limit French naval access as much as possible. In early October, the bombardment of the city begins. Although many of Savannah's buildings are damaged, the British defenses remain intact. When the British do not surrender, Estaing, eager to end the siege quickly due to disease spreading on his ships, plans an assault. On the evening of October 8th, Estaing and Lincoln give orders for the Allied attack. They devise a strategy for a feint on the left, while French and American columns aim to strike against British redoubts on the right. Redoubts believed to be poorly defended, before clearing the breached defensive works to the river. However, the British have been tipped off about the Allied plan. A sergeant major in the Continental Army deserts to the British after receiving Lincoln's orders and informs General Prevost about the Franco-American attack. Later that morning at 4:00 a.m., the Allied assault begins. A thick morning fog blankets the battlefield, hindering communication and confusing the advancing Allies. The feint on the left effectively holds back British troops, while the French in the center engage Loyalists from North Carolina but struggle to gain ground. On the right, the main attack by the French columns dressed in white uniforms, is hampered by swamps, causing their formations to lose cohesion. The Allies' main target is a significant British redoubt on the right, now manned by Scotsmen and Loyalist militias. In intense trench-to-trench fighting, some French units make progress as the assaults escalate. However, casualties begin to rise, with many Frenchmen falling to grapeshot and precise American rifle fire. To the left of the French, the First Continental Wave against the main British redoubt also makes notable progress, raising their flag on the outer slopes. Yet, in fierce fighting, the British manage to hold on and eventually push the assault back. A Second Continental Wave advances, but following French orders, they move too far left and find themselves stuck in swampy ground while facing heavy cannon fire. As the battle rages on across the fortifications, Count Pulaski, leading the Continental Cavalry, charges forward with 200 horsemen. The cavalry attempts to bypass the British defenses and storm deep into the city. However, despite their bravery, enfilade fire from British positions begins to take a toll on their ranks. Count Pulaski is struck by grapeshot and falls gravely wounded. His men soon abandon the attack and carry their dying leader back to friendly lines. With this final setback, Estaing, who has been wounded twice in the arm and leg, calls off the assault. The battle has proven costly and disastrous for the Franco-American cause, with nearly 900 men lost and hundreds of bodies scattered across Savannah's defensive works. The next day, despite Lincoln's pleas to continue the siege, Estaing decides he has had enough and withdraws to his ships, seeking safety in the Caribbean. After the battle, a stalemate resumes in Georgia. The Continentals retreat north to Augusta and Charlestown, while the British begin re-establishing civil administration. James Wright returns as the royal governor, accompanied by new judges, magistrates, and pro-British civil leaders. Further north, Washington has been employing a Fabian strategy against British General Clinton's main army, avoiding direct confrontation. Instead, both sides have engaged in guerrilla warfare and raids, British attacks on coastal towns, and continental actions against Britain's Indian allies. By the end of 1779, Clinton, frustrated by the lack of progress and motivated by the victory at Savannah, decides to shift his focus to the south. In late December, Clinton and his second-in-command, Cornwallis, depart from New York with 8,500 men. To gain control of the southern colonies, a coveted target remains Charlestown in South Carolina. This city is the largest in the South, featuring a major port and convenient access to the surrounding colonies. For Clinton, in early 1780, eager to regain the initiative in the war, this city is now his focus. By mid-February, the British land 30 miles south of Charlestown and begin their approach. Continental General Lincoln is in command and has been fortifying the city and nearby forts. However, his troops are not adequately trained or equipped to launch a proactive attack against the British as Washington had done in Philadelphia 3 years earlier. While some advise him to evacuate the city while he still can, Lincoln faces significant political pressure to hold the position and prevent the British from establishing a critical base in the South. Charlestown is located on a peninsula, which gives it a seemingly natural defense. However, for an enemy with a powerful navy, the city's natural defenses can also be a disadvantage. Lincoln anticipates that the main assault will come from land and has slaves constructing trenches and redoubts across the neck of the peninsula. As the Continental forces prepare for a siege, the British gradually tighten their grip around the city. Throughout the siege, South Carolinian Loyalist cavalry, led by the notorious Banastre Tarleton, efficiently defeat several Patriot forces lingering outside the city. On April 8th, the Royal Navy, despite sustaining some damage from cannon fire at Fort Moultrie, enters the inner harbor. Simultaneously, British siege works are completed and bombardment begins against the city and its defenses. The British intentionally use fire bombs and red-hot shots, causing fires to spread rapidly. An informal fire brigade is formed within the city, while citizens seek refuge in their cellars. As the British siege works inch closer, by April 19th, they are only 250 yards from the main defensive line. Lincoln attempts limited sorties to attack British positions, but these efforts are poorly coordinated and easily repelled. As the days go by, the situation for the defenders grows increasingly dire. Under pressure from civil leaders and his Council of War, Lincoln begins to weigh his options. Unfortunately, evacuation is now impossible due to a shortage of boats and the presence of British shore batteries and the Royal Navy. With no signs of a relief force, he finds himself in a challenging predicament. Despite a strong start, all is not well in the British camp. General Cornwallis, feeling frustrated that he is not in overall command, has become increasingly uncooperative with Clinton. Cornwallis and Clinton have contrasting strategies for the war. Clinton prefers a more defensive approach to hold key cities and territory, while Cornwallis advocates for offensive operations to dominate the countryside. Much to Clinton's annoyance, he eventually concedes to Cornwallis' demands for a separate, independent command. To further tighten the pressure, Cornwallis aims to capture surrounding fortifications in late April. Along the main line of contact, the British taunt the garrison by firing shots of rice and sugar over the defenses. With army rations already being reduced, morale begins to plummet. The last fort outside the city falls in early May, while Charlestown endures relentless bombardment from British batteries. Many members of General Lincoln's Council of War have been urging him to surrender the city, and on May 10th, a petition from both the militia and citizens of Charlestown is sent to Lincoln, requesting him to capitulate. With supplies running low and no prospects for reinforcements or escape, a white flag is raised on the outer works the next day. After just 6 weeks of resistance, the siege of Charlestown comes to an end. The battle marks a significant defeat for the Patriot cause, with 5,500 men taken prisoner. Even worse, despite Lincoln's attempts to negotiate for better terms, the British demand only total surrender. Traditionally, a defeated army is granted the honors of war, allowing them to surrender with flags flying, drums beating, and weapons in hand. However, Clinton is not in a generous mood and forces the Continentals to lay down their arms and surrender unconditionally, an act widely perceived as a disgrace for an army. While militiamen and officers are mostly paroled, many Continental troops face the notoriously harsh conditions of prison ships. Clinton finally achieved the decisive victory he had been seeking in New York, but his success also stemmed from the failings of the Continental forces. Lincoln was reluctant to abandon a position of serious disadvantage and conducted a lackluster defense. He harbored unrealistic hopes for relief and ultimately allowed pressure from civilians to influence his decision-making. After the battle, there are almost no substantial Continental forces remaining in the South, allowing the British to consolidate their hold on Georgia while rapidly expanding their control in South Carolina. Patriot support is now at its lowest in the southern colonies, and the British seem poised to make significant gains. So far, General Clinton's gamble in the South appears to be paying off. However, both partisan and Continental forces are gathering around him, and they are determined not to let the recent defeats go unanswered. Battle of Bunker Hill and Siege of Boston, 1775. In April 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at the Battle of Lexington. News of the fighting and the surprising British defeat spread rapidly across North America. In a remarkable turn of events, American colonists began besieging the British Army in Boston, and both sides were eager for a second encounter to sell scores and land a decisive blow. Many patriots left the city to join the growing colonial militias, while loyalists flocked to Boston from the countryside seeking protection, with some joining loyalist units attached to the British Army. The fighting followed years of civil disagreement over the British Parliament's rights to impose laws and taxes in the colonies without representation. After Lexington, many colonists felt betrayed by His Majesty's army, prompting militias and civil leaders to take action against loyalist authority wherever possible. Royal governors struggled to maintain control, and most loyalists went underground. In the weeks following the battle, British military arsenals were seized, including the poorly defended Fort Ticonderoga in New York on May 10, 1775. Vital cannons were captured, including heavy mortars and howitzers that the colonial forces would desperately need in the upcoming conflict. On the same day, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Congress gradually took charge of the situation, becoming the de facto government of the 13 colonies, voting to borrow money, recruit new regiments, and purchase essential supplies like gunpowder. Although most delegates still favored reconciliation with Great Britain, the Battle of Lexington shook those prospects. In June, with no indication that the British Parliament would repeal the Intolerable Acts or negotiate, Congress voted to create the Continental Army, appointing George Washington as its new commander-in-chief. The British forces, led by General Gage, remained confined in Boston and low on supplies. Gage made the unusual decision to abandon Charlestown, despite its strategic value overlooking Boston. He also offered a pardon to the colonial forces if they laid down their arms, except for the leadership, which only heightened tensions further. The British government, now doubtful of Gage's command abilities, sent Generals Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne along with reinforcements to keep a close watch on him. For the moment, Gage remained in overall command of the 6,000-strong British force, and in June, realizing his mistake or trying to appease his new lieutenants, he decided to reoccupy Charlestown and fortify the southern Dorchester Heights. Gage believed he could use these positions as a staging ground to break the siege, and a quick victory outside of Boston could potentially end the war before it truly began, saving the situation and his reputation. Although the newly formed Continental Army still lacked the training, equipment, and organization of its British counterpart, it was a formidable force at 15,000 strong. The Continental forces also had an intelligence network within the city, and within days of the British plans to seize the heights being agreed upon, the commander of the Continental Army, General Artemas Ward, was informed and moved to thwart the British. Even though his army did not yet possess heavy cannons, General Ward understood that if he could occupy the heights with artillery, he could quickly make the British position in Boston untenable by bombarding both the city and the crucial British supplies that could only arrive by sea. Both armies recognized the importance of controlling the heights for victory in Boston, but since the earlier British withdrawal, the peninsula had remained a no-man's land, cautiously observed by the Royal Navy. There were two main hills on the peninsula, Bunker Hill to the north and Breed's Hill to the south, which overlooked Boston. Breed's Hill stood at 75 feet in height, with a steep slope on its eastern side. The peninsula itself was small, over a mile long and wide, with access restricted by a narrow land corridor known as the Neck. Charlestown lay mostly abandoned, with unharvested hay in the fields leading waist-high grass that concealed broken terrain, fences, clay pits, and swamps. In the early hours of June 17th, just before Gage planned to take the heights, Colonel William Prescott led 2 Massachusetts regiments of 1,000 men onto the peninsula. Mostly without uniforms, the men wore civilian clothes and carried entrenchment tools, wicker baskets, and 1 day's worth of rations per soldier. Although ordered to fortify Bunker Hill, Prescott instead directed that a redoubt be built on Breed's Hill, likely because of its commanding views over Boston. Prescott and his men dig trenches and an impressive square. Fortifications featuring earthen walls and firing platforms that are 130 feet wide are being constructed. The Continental soldiers work diligently throughout the night, and as dawn approaches, they are soon spotted by Royal Navy ships that begin firing at their position. British Commander Gage wakes to the sound of gunfire. Looking across the bay, he recognizes the seriousness of the situation and understands the necessity of controlling the heights to remain in Boston, not to mention to break free from the siege. Although he is urged to act swiftly, he takes his time, discussing the best course of action with his commanding officers. General Clinton suggests taking advantage of the narrow passage to the peninsula, landing behind the Continental forces to seize control of the Neck and besiege the Continental positions until they surrender. However, Gage, adhering to the military doctrine of the time, prefers not to risk exposing his men to attacks from 2 sides and opts for a more straightforward and bloodier direct assault on Breed's Hill. Troops are gathered in Boston, and in the early afternoon, Gage instructs General Howe to lead 2,000 British regulars in storming the heights. The British row across the bay in longboats, their bayonets shimmering in the bright sun. At 1 p.m., companies of light infantry, grenadiers, and marines begin landing to the east of Charlestown. Both sides call for reinforcements, and Continental forces from Connecticut arrive to bolster Prescott's left flank, hastily constructing fletches, breastworks, and trenches. Over 3,000 men from the new Continental Army are now positioned across the hills, with nearly 2,000 concentrated around Breed's Hill. The British plan to encircle the redoubt by advancing through the Continental defenses on the right flank while distracting and pinning the forces in the center with a feigned frontal assault, after pushing aside the defending forces from Connecticut. The Continental forces on the redoubt would become isolated and attacked from both the front and the rear, leading to a swift British victory. Before the attack commences, Continental snipers are spotted in Charlestown, prompting the order for Royal Navy ships to bombard the town, setting it ablaze. General Howe, like Gage, underestimates the colonial forces, dismissing both their capabilities and determination. Reflecting this mindset, he decides to arrange most of his men in line formations for the attack. In 18th century warfare, Line formations were typically used for direct battlefield engagements, where a wide front of soldiers 2 to 4 ranks deep presented more men to the enemy, maximizing firepower while remaining cohesive enough to charge with bayonets. While line formations are slow-moving and vulnerable at the flanks and rear, trained troops can quickly organize into squares to defend against cavalry attacks. Throughout the American Revolution, infantry would come to dominate the battlefield, as both sides struggled to maintain large cavalry formations. For attacking fortified positions, military doctrine of the time recommended advancing in a column formation, allowing soldiers to move as a narrower group to minimize frontal casualties and deliver a concentrated impact upon contact. Most soldiers on both sides used similar flintlock muskets, with the Brown Bess being the most common. These muskets were typical of the era and could be fired 3 to 4 times per minute by a trained soldier, who could expect to hit a target 50% of the time at 300 feet or 90 meters away. Many colonials also utilized more modern rifles, which had twice the range of muskets but were slower to load, firing 1 shot per minute. Due to the low accuracy of muskets, experienced forces often waited to fire until they were within 150 feet of the enemy, allowing them to unleash a more lethal volley. At 3 p.m., the attack begins. General Howe leads his men from the front as the main assault advances on the right flank. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers lead the way, but their progress is hindered by the weight of their full packs and the challenging terrain ahead. As the British forces move forward, they pause for artillery pieces to fire, which caused minimal damage to the entrenched Continental positions. The Continental forces wait patiently until the British are just 100 feet away before finally opening fire. At that distance, they can inflict heavy casualties on the British ranks, who are easy targets in their slow-moving line formations. 100 Fusiliers are immediately killed, and many more are wounded at the front of the assault, causing the initial push to falter and then collapse as the British retreat in disarray. The secondary attack on the redoubt meets a similar fate, worsened by remaining snipers in Charlestown and the heat of the afternoon sun as the troops march uphill in their wool uniforms. The British forces withdraw as the attack ends in failure, and General Howe reorganizes his men to the east of Charlestown. Howe prepares for a second assault, this time ordering a full attack on the redoubt instead of a feigned one, to be combined with a closer supported attack from the right. He still hopes to break through the Continental lines and encircle the redoubt to capture or destroy the heart of colonial resistance. As the British march past their fallen comrades, they come within range of the Continental forces, who again unleash a devastating fire. With rifles and muskets resting along their entrenched positions, the Continental forces make easy targets of the British, whose officers decide to pause and respond with volley after volley of ineffective fire instead of pushing forward and directly assaulting the positions. They are pushed back once more, suffering heavy casualties. However, confusion also arises in the Continental ranks as critical reinforcements arrive but remain directionless on Bunker Hill, while many others flee the field. Fresh supplies are also not reaching them, leaving Prescott and his remaining men on Breed's Hill, now numbering less than 1,000, running dangerously low on ammunition. Before a third assault can commence, 400 British reinforcements arrive from Boston, accompanied by an eager General Clinton, who rallies an additional 200 wounded to prepare for the next attack. Howe, likely shaken by the high casualties, now alters the formation of his men to columns and orders one large assault to be directed solely at the redoubt on Breed's Hill. He instructs his men to drop their heavy packs and to utilize their deadly bayonets, which the Continental Army, now short on ammunition, does not possess in large quantities. While the British have come to fear the precise accuracy of Continental rifle fire, the Continentals are anxious about the cold steel bayonets of the regulars. The British feign a small attack on the right, but then the majority of the men charge up the hill with their bayonets ready. Officers encourage their men forward, urging them to push on as artillery pounds the colonial positions. This time, the concentration and speed of the attack proved to be formidable assault shows results, and the regulars begin to breach the redoubt. But Continental troops, using their muskets as clubs, the soldiers are waiting for them, and brutal hand-to-hand combat ensues. The Continental commander, Colonel Prescott, is right in the thick of the fighting, skillfully parrying bayonets with his saber. However, the British forces, with their superior training and weaponry, hold a significant advantage and begin to push the Continentals back, inflicting heavy casualties. Prescott and his men make the decision to retreat from the hill, but it's not a rout. The Continental forces manage to fall back to Bunker Hill in an orderly fashion, partially protected by their left flank. General Clinton, eager to prevent the Continental forces from reorganizing on Bunker Hill, starts preparing British troops for another assault. However, before this can be launched, the Colonials begin their withdrawal from the peninsula. While many of Prescott's men are disorganized or retreating, they have accomplished enough after a brutal day of fighting. The Continental Army has been driven from the field, but at a significant cost. The British suffer over 1,000 dead and wounded, which is about 40% of their total forces engaged, while the Continental losses are lighter, totaling 450 dead, wounded, and captured. Both sides made mistakes during the battle. The British, for the second time in the campaign, underestimated their opponents, and General Gage acted too slowly in the morning, allowing the Continental Army time to prepare and reinforce. Strategically, if Gage had opted for General Clinton's plan to surround the Continental positions and utilize the Royal Navy effectively, a far less costly victory could have been achieved. General Howe also made poor tactical choices by attacking in line formation and unnecessarily splitting his forces across a wide front. For the new Continental Army, even though they performed admirably, they still lack military discipline. Orders are frequently ignored, much-needed supplies do not arrive, and high rates of desertion significantly weaken the front at crucial moments during the battle. 2 weeks later in July, the newly appointed commander of the Continental Army, General George Washington, arrives in Cambridge and begins the process of reorganizing the free-spirited militia into a professional fighting force. The army he inherits is undisciplined, with poorly constructed trench lines, low supplies, and unsanitary living conditions. Soldiers interact with their British counterparts at outposts, and many come and go from the camp as they please. Washington quickly takes action by removing officers, conducting court-martials, and disciplining those who do not follow orders. He informs the army that they are now fighting for Congress and the United Provinces of North America. By September, his new entrenchments are complete, and fresh gunpowder has arrived. Eager to take the fight to the British, Washington proposes an ambitious amphibious assault through the south of Boston, planning to row his men into the city. However, his senior officers consider it too risky, and Washington respects their judgment. Despite the intense fighting at Bunker Hill, Congress remains divided. John Dickinson, a key delegate from Pennsylvania, leads the majority in still seeking peace and reconciliation with Great Britain. In July, Congress sends a final petition to King George III, affirming their loyalty and requesting a lasting settlement that removes Parliament's undemocratic authority over the colonies. Congress hopes this petition will initiate negotiations, but by the time it reaches the king, he has already signed the proclamation of rebellion after hearing about the events at both Lexington and Bunker Hill, and he will not read the petition from Congress. This proclamation declares the colonies to be in a state of rebellion and instructs officials across the empire to suppress the rebels by force. Although many on both sides of the Atlantic wish to avoid civil war, the proclamation has significantly weakened the position of delegates like John Dickinson and his Whig supporters in Parliament, making reconciliation seem increasingly unattainable. Within days of the news of the battle reaching London, Gage is recalled to Britain in relative disgrace. Concerns about his command capabilities had already existed, and Bunker Hill is the final straw. General William Howe takes over as the British commander in North America. Besides the high casualties, the Battle of Bunker Hill significantly alters British strategies. Howe is deeply influenced by the battle and gains a new respect for the Continental Army. By winter, the Continental forces have dwindled due to the end of enlistments and desertions, while the British, with fresh reinforcements, now have 10,000 men in Boston. Although Howe outnumbers Washington for the first time in the campaign, he hesitates to risk an attack. He faces his own challenges, poor morale leading to desertion, as his men endure a cold winter without adequate firewood, proper housing, and fresh food, which can only come from the sea and is often captured by colonial privateers. Despite the apparent opportunity, the British command has become overly cautious just as they gain the chance to go on the offensive. Washington is acutely aware that as winter drags on, his army will weaken. He proposes 2 further direct assaults on Boston, one in October and another in February, which would involve Continental forces rushing across the ice-covered bay to attack the city. However, once again, his senior officers disagree, and the plans are abandoned. A stalemate now exists between the cautious General Howe and the restrained Washington. In November, Henry Knox, a 25-year-old bookseller with a passion for military history, suggests a way to bring heavy cannons to the army and end the siege: Fort Ticonderoga. Washington sends Knox with orders to transport the heavy guns to Boston, but this is no easy task, as the 59 selected cannons weigh over 60 tons. Knox builds sledges to move the cannons through deep snow and challenging terrain, and transports the valuable cargo 300 miles in what will be known as the Noble Train of Artillery. He arrives in Cambridge 10 weeks later in late January to a hero's welcome. In March 1776, Washington positions his heavy artillery on Dorchester Heights, a no-man's land until then, which poses a new threat to bombard both the city and Royal Navy ships. Howe recognizes the danger and plans an assault on the heights, but a storm scatters his landing boats, making an attack impossible. The British are left with no choice but to evacuate the city. Over almost a year of fighting, Howe has squandered valuable time in Boston, engaging in an unnecessary siege that he refused to break. However, a new strategy is emerging in the British High Command, and with fresh reinforcements finally arriving from Europe, Howe is ready to turn the tide in 1776 and finally go on the offensive. Thank you for joining us for our series on the American Revolution.